Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Now, talking about the Western Conference Finals, we have the matchup of the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks. Really, both of these teams could have very well been sent home in the last round to lower-seeded teams in their respective series in the second round. And I think that, like we talked about a little bit yesterday, we are in a place here where the next generation has officially arrived, and that includes the Eastern Conference, which we just talked about as well prior to the break. The fact that we have Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, Jason Tatum, and Tyrese Halliburton all as the cornerstones for these teams. Likely one of those four players are going to be the Finals MVP and have a conversation in terms of the face of the NBA moving forward. But first, all of these players, in order to do so, have to get through their opponent. So for the Timberwolves and the Mavericks, I sort of was repeatedly saying during last series with Minnesota and Denver that I thought whoever won that series was going to come out of the Western Conference. Now, the Dallas Mavericks would like something to say to that. They have been very much impressive through their postseason run so far as well. They beat the Thunder in 6, and they did so in large part as much as at times it was the Luka Doncic show and it was Kyrie Irving getting involved in that whole conversation. A massive X factor for them was these role players having the opportune rebounding from Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford against an Oklahoma City Thunder team that didn't really have size and that repeatedly hurt them down the stretch of pretty much all of these games. And that isn't necessarily going to be quite on the table against the Timberwolves, where the Wolves have much better rebounders in Gobert, in Towns. They have size. They have players that could potentially make. I think that Derek Lively has been tremendous through this playoff run, but he's had a lot of moments where he has looked like a rookie. And I think that there are things that can be exploited if he's pulled out onto the perimeter with sort of forcing the ball into his hands, the decision making. I think his hands in general, too, it feels like he just moves at such a fast pace that he can almost get a little bit ahead of himself. Now, again, he's been tremendous for them, but the sort of big man position is an advantage for Minnesota in pretty much every series. And the Mavericks went out at the trade deadline, and you saw, even if you want to go back to the end of last season where they sort of tanked down the stretch to improve their draft position and then ended up trading up in the draft to get Derek Lively, it has been an emphasis for them of trying to acquire some talent at the big man position, and they did so with both Derek Lively and with Daniel Gafford at the trade deadline. I do want to quickly look up here about what the updates are on Maxi Kleber, who is somebody who I think could definitely have an impact in this series. I talked about it before. I think that he has sort of been overlooked, his importance to this Mavericks team, and obviously the Mavs were able to play fine without him during this Oklahoma City Thunder series, but if they aren't going to be able to necessarily overwhelm Minnesota with the size of their own, what they could do is sort of the known commodity of trying to play Rudy Gobert off of the court, which we've seen in the postseason before. How do you do that? It's with various shooters, and it is spacing, trying to get Gobert out of the paint and have him not be this roamer, which he has been able to do. We talked about this at length yesterday, where Karl Anthony Towns was able to really hold down that matchup against Jokic, and Gobert was just able to impact just about everything at the rim. And that is part of what will be most important for the Mavericks in this series, is trying to spread out the Timberwolves. So as things currently stand with Maxi Kleber, as I sort of look this up on the fly here, it sounds like he is going to continue to be out for the beginning of this series. There is some optimism that he could potentially return in the Western Conference Finals, but ultimately doesn't sound all that encouraging. Now, again, fingers crossed that he can make the return, but the way that Kleba was able to sort of play the stretch five role for them down the end of these games, specifically if you want to look to the first round when they played the LA Clippers, I thought that was really impactful and somebody who could potentially be an X factor in this series as well. But again, I think that the Mavericks don't really have the type of defender to put against Luka Doncic. I'm curious who they're going to look to be the primary defender. I would probably lean with PJ Washington as things currently stand. I would probably lean with Anthony Edwards or Jaden McDaniels to begin here, but I still feel like, I don't know, Luka, it's really interesting the conversation of who is the best players to guard him, because he's likely going to get his regardless. Now, Jaden McDaniels, somebody, especially while Luka Doncic is still dealing with these various injuries that he's been put through up to this point, having Jaden McDaniels, who we just saw last series, is willing to pick up full court, sort of tire out defenders a little bit extra through the course of a game, could be something to take in mind. I feel like Kyrie is going to, for the most part, except for the minutes where he's on the bench and Luka is on, Kyrie's probably going to be the primary ball handler in those instances just to avoid that problem. I'm sure it's something that the Mavericks are going to be aware of headed into the series, but I think that when you look at this sort of equation as a whole, the Mavericks are a team that has been very, I wouldn't say reliant necessarily, but their three-point shooting is sort of what was the difference in that series against the Thunder, where it seemed like just about every single game came down to who was going to hit more threes between them and the Thunder. The Thunder were the best three-point shooting team pretty much in terms of at least makes and possibly even percentage as well. Actually, the opposite there. Percentage is what they were the best at, and the games where they weren't able to hit from three, they really struggled because the Mavericks did a tremendous job of protecting the paint. And that still can be a very real possibility in this series as well, where the Timberwolves are maybe a little bit short-handed in terms of being able to space out the three. Now, they've shot decently well through the course of this postseason so far, at least in terms of total makes. Now, percentage-wise, they have shot just under 36% through the postseason as a whole, so not saying they can't do it whatsoever. They don't necessarily have, levels of sharpshooters. Now, what they do have is at least some big men who can space out as well in Naz Reid and Karl Anthony Towns, and that's where I think that the Derek Lively conversation sort of comes into play maybe a little bit more, of trying to get him out on the perimeter. Daniel Gafford is somebody who I just don't think is, maybe, at least from my eye test, I don't have any numbers to back this up, hasn't necessarily been tested on the perimeter quite as much. I thought that there were a lot more instances where the Mavericks were trying to make that happen some, but ultimately, this is going to be another defensive series in my eyes, and you have some of the top players in terms of being able to go out there and get you a bucket between Kyrie and Luka and Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns. So, it's going to definitely lean on the role players as well to be able to throw the different looks at opposing players. I talked about the idea of who's going to guard Luka. I don't know necessarily who's going to be the Anthony Edwards guard either. It's probably going to be PJ Washington, which is what I sort of started to talk about earlier in the segment, but I don't feel great about that necessarily either, because it seems like you might need him to help provide some size as well in the post. it's going to be really interesting to see. I think that the Mavericks have a lot more obstacles in terms of personnel to overcome in this series. But again, what I do think they have an advantage of is they are a better three-point shooting team. And the identity of this roster for a lot of the year was being a prolific offensive squad. And now that they've added the defense in as well, it sort of gives them at least a little bit of armor to be able to not be quite as explosive on offense, be able to overcome the Luka injury or some minutes where Kyrie goes quiet. But they do still have that offensive upside, especially when you see PJ Washington, who wasn't quite as dominant as, he had that stretch of games 2, 3, and 4 where he was unstoppable offensively, tailed off a little bit at the end of the series. But, if they can get that level of production from him, Derrick Jones Jr. was incredible, sort of picking up where PJ left off in that closeout game. A lot of players here that can step up for them. And for Minnesota, I do think that outside of their top two, now Jaden McDaniels did have a good Game 7 as well, at least from a scoring perspective, but in the half court, I don't know if they have quite as many players who can make an impact like that. Now, Mike Conley, never want to downplay his importance to the team, but I am going to go, as much as I feel like I've been talking more on the Maverick side of this, I'm going to go with the Timberwolves in this series. I think this one goes 6 as well. Now, I could see it actually ending sooner for the Timberwolves, but the Mavericks have a very good chance to sort of stretch this thing out. As things currently stand, the Timberwolves are minus 170 favorites on DraftKings, Mavericks at plus 145. But let me know what your thoughts and expectations are in the comments section. We are now, though, going to be taking our next break and going to be moving off of the NBA playoffs. We had a Game 7 last night between the Edmonton Oilers and the Vancouver Canucks, so we're going to be diving into that. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.